You're listening to a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
And it's all a very, very beautiful game of chess or game of poker, or I can't use the word checkers because it's far greater than any checker game that I've ever seen, but it's a very...
Hello and welcome to the US-China Trade War Update. I'm Finbarr Bermingham on the political economy desk here at the South China Morning Post. We have a bumper issue for you this week for what has been a massive week in international trade. On Wednesday night, Thursday morning our time, Trump and Liu He signed their Phase 1 trade deal, bringing some sort of conclusion to 18 months of rocky negotiations. We were burning the midnight oil here in Hong Kong, and I'm delighted to be joined by a very special guest and a fellow trade geek in Ben Kostrezewa. Ben will give us some idea how these things really work on the inside. He's a trade lawyer in Hong Kong and a former staffer at the USTR. We'll also have political economy editor Zhou and US Bureau Chief Robert Delaney to discuss how this deal and those who negotiated it are being viewed domestically. Some great insights in that segment on Liu He. And finally, the trade deal is not the only problem facing the Chinese economy. And today, it was confirmed that last year brought the lowest economic growth for 30 years in China. My colleague Sidney Leung from our political economy team is in the studio to discuss that and some very interesting trends in the Chinese birth rate. Let's get to it.
This is an unbelievable deal for the United States, and ultimately it's a great deal for both countries, and it's going to also lead to even a more stable peace.
We have just heard Donald Trump say this is an unbelievable deal for the United States. He has said that nothing has ever been done like this with China. I'm joined by Zhou, the political economy editor here at the South China Morning Post, and US Bureau Chief Robert Delaney to discuss what happened this week. Zhou, how accurate does this seem to you, Donald Trump's playing up of the deal, and how has that been reflected in China's own handling of what happened?
Okay, that's very interesting, because Trump apparently is taking credit for this, and as we have reported before, that even his counterpart as vice premier, he is so eager to claim that he has won from this trade war with China. And from the China side, it's more mixed. I think Beijing is trying to be, kind of optimistic about this deal, but it's still very guarded. That's why we see in the first hours of signing the deal, we see the state television provide live coverage. We see that Xinhua and the People's Daily almost at the same time breaking the news saying, the deal has been reached. But the full document did not get published until 8 hours later. And from all the editorials, what I can read from the Chinese official media, there will be two key messages Beijing is trying to deliver to its domestic audience and also to the world. First of all, this is something a very good beginning or for a more manageable relationship down the road between China and the United States. As Liu He said at his press conference after signing the deal, he said, this is basically saying no to decoupling between the two biggest economies of the world. So for China, this is an example to show that even for people like Trump, China can manage the differences and it can manage the conflicts. And, we can sit down and talk and finally have something. And this is one key message China is trying to deliver. And the second point is Beijing is trying to say that, look at the deal. Many of these things seems on face value, it's China concession to what Trump has demanded. But in fact, that's actually very good for China itself. Intellectual property rights protection. China needs better protection of intellectual property rights so that China can have more innovations. Opening up the market, it's time for China to reopen its market a little bit wider, have more competition so that its domestic economy can be, growing in a more healthier way instead of relying on zombie companies of state-owned enterprises. And even for these obvious concessions from Beijing, for instance, setting up the office of checking the progress or the implementation of the deal, China is trying to say, this could be a possible mode for solve future conflicts. And China is trying very hard to present this as, we are not kowtowing to Trump. This deal is actually good for China, good for the US, and good for the rest of the world. At the same time, all these rhetorics from Beijing cannot quell all the criticism among many of the independent observers, there's social media critics. And for this one, I read one article, which is by anonymous author, which is quite interesting. He said, "We still remembered during the collapse of the talks in May, Liu He has said there are 3 red lines. First of all the tariffs have to be revoked.
Yeah.
Secondly, the text has to be balanced. The third one is this enforcement of the checking of the implementation,
yes.
Basically the enforcement mechanism. Basically, all the 3 red lines have been crossed this time. So what's the point of hanging out for another 6 months? Why don't just say yes back in May?
Yeah,
this is one of the argument quite strong in China actually, and also there are people comparing kind of this deal to the 19th century when the Ching dynasty was humiliated by the Western powers. You send your prime minister to or one of the most senior officials to the foreign capitals and to begging that let's have peace.
Yeah.
But these voices, are not, of course, officially accepted by Beijing. Beijing is trying to say this deal is good. And objectively, in my view, I think this deal can buy China some time, and at least it is good for the Chinese investors and business dealers to have more stable expectation for 2020. Mm. And if you want to set up a factory, if you want to build up a plant in China, and you now know that the tariffs will not go up tomorrow. So this is kind of helping the Chinese economy. I think that value should not be underestimated.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting unpacking of how this has been received in China from Zhou. Rob, can I just turn to you and ask you, do you think, that's a highly nuanced version of that Zhou has given us of how this has been received in China. There is debate, there's a lot of dissidence, but there's also very colourful debate. Do you think there's awareness in the US that China isn't this sort of monolithic power where there is no debate? All of the discussion rests at the very upper echelons of the government. Is there awareness of that in the US?
I don't think there's much awareness at all, except generally in the U.S. Certainly among voters and in general. The thing is that the trade war didn't really hit Americans as badly as many politicians who are against it suggested it might have, and you had the tariffs were. They were pretty much buried. They were pretty much buried in the prices that companies paid for what they were importing from China. They were buried in the final retail prices, but they weren't quite high enough for the tariffs to become a bread and butter issue for most Americans. And so I don't think that prompted anyone in the U.S. generally to really analyze much what was going on in China. Mm-hmm. The perception is in among most Americans is just that, especially in these past couple of years, is just that China is this big, menacing, growing superpower, and we just need someone up at the top in the U.S. to take care of this problem. Mm-hmm. And so there wasn't a tremendous amount of opposition to the trade war outside of particular farm states, outside of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And also the political atmosphere was really dominated by, especially for the past year, the Russia investigation, the Ukraine investigation, and most recently what happened in Iran. These issues captured the attention of Americans much more than this trade war did. So I think it really allowed Donald Trump and his administration to characterize the outcome as they wish to characterize it. Yeah,
that's really interesting. And sort of there's been. Let's talk about the last 18 months. Some of the major characters who have been part of this drama. On the Chinese side, somebody perhaps who Americans weren't familiar with before the trade war, Vice Premier Liu He. Zhou, tell us a bit more about how his standing is at home. You mentioned that there was some dissidence at perhaps the fact that he had crossed these 3 red lines, which he outlined in May last year. But has this trade war and how he's dealt with it increased his political standing in Beijing?
Well, I think so, because first of all, let's say if you want to find anyone who is willing to take the job of negotiating with Trump, I think it's a very difficult job to find anyone who will say, okay, I volunteer, you're not doing a good job, let me do it.
Do you think he volunteered, or do you think
I don't think he's volunteered. But if let's imagine a scenario when the political bureau is having a meeting and Liu He said, okay, if you criticize me of not capable enough, why don't go for yourself? And I don't think anyone will take that. Yeah. Will take that position. So everyone in Beijing knows that it's a difficult part because it's beyond Communist Party's control. Okay, it's Donald Trump, and behind this is the whole United States. China cannot control that. The outcome is not one-sided, so it's a tough job. And Liu He is basically, okay, I'm the man. I'm responsible. I'm willing to take this job. Even this job is so difficult. There are so many, dangerous things for me. No matter whatever the deal I sign, there will be criticism at home. So this shows like Liu He is a man who is willing to take the risks, take the responsibility. And the second thing is that throughout the whole negotiation process, we can see that he has received the full trust from President Xi. There were moments when there are gossips in Beijing that, he's, especially after the collapse of the talks in May, like, Beijing is going to find a new one to replace him, and which turned out all to be groundless rumors.
He disappeared for a couple of weeks, remember? And everybody's like, where is Liu He?
Well, everyone deserves a few holidays. Yeah. Anyway, he stayed on, and you can see that it's from the right beginning to the end. It is Liu He, he's irreplaceable. And then if we look at the result, first of all, we don't whether this result is good or bad. This is a happy ending or unhappy ending. He delivered something, okay? And this is also something that he can tell to his critics back home, like I'm handling this difficult task, and now I have this result to bring to you. You may be not 100% about this, but I'm already tried my best.
Yeah.
So I think after this, and his experience is gained in dealing with the Americans. His experiences in knowing how different factions, especially like Robert Lighthizer, Ching, is functioning within the White House, making him even more like indispensable person in Beijing.
Yeah.
So I say yes, his position certainly get elevated after the trade deal.
And one of the very interesting differences that emerged from after the signing of the deal was how both sides spoke about the potential follow-up for Phase 2. Liu He said, this is not something we want to be rushing into, whereas Trump, I did a Control F on the search on the transcription of the, the signing ceremony. He must have said Phase 2 10 or 20 times. But Rob, is there willingness do you think, in the US to continue down this track, or is there awareness that perhaps Phase 2 might be just beyond their reach at the moment?
Well, certainly all of the business associations are pushing Donald Trump to get the Phase 2 negotiations started ASAP. At the same time, I think I don't think anyone expects that the Phase 2 resolution for Phase 2, or that there will be a Phase 2 agreement anytime soon. But I think regardless, they feel that the business community feels that they may as well just get this started ASAP. So they're pushing for it. They're pushing for dialogue. And I think the general perception is, if you look at the editorials in the U.S., across a wide range of viewpoints within the news, whether it's the New York Times, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, whether it's Bloomberg, the overall message is it probably wasn't worth it to go through this trade war. This might have been expedited. We may have resolved this problem more easily by building a coalition with the U.S. allies. However, at least we've paused the trade war. At least we have a little bit more certainty at least for the time being. So the reception has been that this is the stage we're at now is a better place than we were last month or any time over the past 2 years.
Yeah, and Zhou, do you think that China has come out the other side of this Phase 1 deal licking its wounds, or is it prepared to continue to negotiate? Is it going to try and kick the can down the road? How do you think Phase 2 will be handled inside Beijing?
Well, I think Beijing will be quite patient in wait and see. And basically, the official line is that the focus now should be in the implementation of the Phase 1 deal. And I think this the implied line is that if the U.S. do not revoke all the tariffs significantly, China basically has no mood to enter into this Phase 2 talks. So, and also, if there was a perception in Beijing that, we have already given enough to you, so why I would be so stupid to rush into a new round that will ask me to give more?
Yeah.
So this kind of attitude, I think, is real in Beijing. So I don't think anyone from President Xi Jinping, from Vice Premier Liu He, that they have the appetite of starting Phase 2 talk as quickly as possible.
Sure. Well, we will be watching very closely. Zhou Xin, Robert Delaney, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're joined by Ben Kostrezewa, a trade lawyer here in Hong Kong with the law firm Hogan Lovells. In a previous life, Ben was the Assistant General Counsel at the USTR, that's the Office of the United States Trade Representative in Washington, D.C., covering China issues. Ben, big week for you?
Since coming to Hong Kong, it feels like they're all big weeks, but this week was particularly big.
Yeah, it's been a roller coaster for us here in the office too. Just sort of think back to your time at USTR. Do you feel like anything resembling what we've seen this week, but also I guess over the last 18 months, did you have any experiences similar to that?
The politics of today are very unique, and certainly this administration takes a different view on process. So what happened is very different. That said, I think that this was a good news and welcome news for the people in USTR and across the street in the White House, where this is seen as a political win and also giving benefits to American companies and consumers and people who are reliant on Chinese goods.
So did you digest the deal as soon as it was made available?
I did. I was up at 2 a.m. Reading it and exchanging notes with colleagues and watching the Twitter reactions like everyone else. Yeah. It was like a movie premiere, but for us trade nerds.
Yeah. Well, we did joke that we might have a viewing party. We never got around to it because it was midweek, but
Right. But I appreciated your live views via message WhatsApp.
Just in the grand scheme of things, this was, I think the final document with all the attachments and stuff was about 96 pages, but we're running with 86 pages. In the grand scheme of things, how does that compare with other trade agreements that you've seen?
Well, it's certainly dramatically smaller than a full free trade agreement, but a free trade agreement that would include all the annexes of tariff schedules and chapters upon chapters that would be a complete FTA that would also go through Congress. I think in my mind, it was a little bit bigger and more comprehensive than perhaps we expected as a Phase 1 deal. After the talks fell apart in April, and that was rumored to be around 150 pages, I think most people expected this Phase 1 deal to be a political arrangement. And the fact that it does have substantive chapters makes me more optimistic that this has some teeth to it.
Yeah. I actually was speaking to an IP professor yesterday who said that the IP chapter is as strong as some that he's seen in a sort of comprehensive trade agreement. So that caught some people by surprise. But I think most people had sort of it didn't really blow many people's minds.
Right. The prevailing view in the trade community is that it could lack substance, that this could be things that China already promised. I take a slightly more optimistic view. You know me well enough that I'm frequently pessimistic about today's politics, but I'm actually a little bit more optimistic that this is something that, even if the substance doesn't quite get translated into policy the way that the negotiators intend or hope for, that at least it's arrested the drop-off in U.S.-China, the degradation of the trade relations, degradation of political relations, and offer some foundation going forward. From last May until today, we really saw U.S. and China starting to move in a negative direction, and maybe this will be a way to create some positive momentum.
Yeah, we'll see. So I mean, in your current work, you obviously have your feet in both worlds. And you're based in Hong Kong. I know that you travel a lot in China. You're back in the US a lot. So this week, what sorts of queries have you been getting? A lot of people, asking you questions. What's in this deal? How can I benefit from this deal? What's been the nature of all these inquiries?
Well, right now, everyone is looking through it with a fine-tooth comb of what it means and how it will be actually implemented. So I think that there has been the questions that clients come to me, whether they're in mainland China or in the United States or elsewhere in the world, they're very, very nitty-gritty questions of how it'll be implemented. And the answer is we don't know yet. A lot of this will take time for both sides to implement, and particularly for China to implement. The intellectual property protections; those are details that will take time to flow through the Chinese government in order to actually be enforceable. The people are asking about the enforcement questions. Does this mean anything because it's such a different deal than an FTA or working through the WTO? And then others are hoping that there are opportunities in China and are looking to sell based on some of the trade expansion provisions, and I think that's positive. On the other hand, I think most U.S. firms and Chinese firms recognize that the tariffs aren't coming off, and those tariffs are a big part of the degradation in trade. And so fundamentally, companies that have moved supply chains outside of China or in the process of moving those supply chains, this probably doesn't change the calculus for them.
Sure. And I think on that note, like most people that I speak with are their expectations have been managed for some time. I mean, this is all like people are a little bit, they're quite pleased that this has been signed, but it doesn't necessarily change the bigger picture. People understand that this is not a grand deal, nor do they expect a phase 2 deal to be signed at least this side of the election. Is that something that you hear too?
I think that's right. I think this is seen as a political victory for the Trump administration, especially they're going into 2020 with a full head of steam, saying we got a deal with China. We got the USMCA went to Trump's desk, I think this morning or yesterday evening U.S. time. They have a limited Japan agreement. They pulled out a TPP. He's going to be able to trumpet that he delivered the promises of the last election, and he's doing it without any apparent recession on the horizon. And so I think he'll be satisfied with where it's at now rather than immediately going into a phase 2 deal that could spook markets and create different expectations.
Sure. And just to finish up, I know somebody who's very in tune with the political scene in Washington. I watched the Democratic debate the other day, and I think there was like maybe one mention of the China deal. And I think it was Tom Steyer, who's probably not going to win the nomination. That to me said, as a trade journalist who's sort of dyed in the wool in this world, that maybe the voters in the US, in Iowa, don't care about this as much as people make out. Is that a fair comment?
I watched that debate too, and I saw that Tom Steyer was the only one who said on day one he'd roll back all the tariffs, and everyone else, I think quite correctly, trade negotiators talk about getting paid for something. And so I think while many of the candidates might not have supported these tariffs in the first place, if they were to be elected president, they would want to be paid to get rolled off these and would use these as in negotiations. Now, they might take a more expansive view of what that means, perhaps on the Democratic side, using that as greater cooperation on items like climate change that matter a lot to Democratic voters. To answer your question, I think Americans care a lot about China. I think they recognize that the U.S.-China trade relationship needed to be rebalanced. Even those who don't have a highly sophisticated view, or they're spending a lot more time caring about their families and jobs and not about the geopolitical messes.
Fair enough.
Right. And I think that's okay. Farmers care a lot about this. I read that the farm bailouts that have happened over the last year or so under the Trump administration are almost double or triple what happened to the auto bailouts. And farmers are suffering across America, particularly in the Midwest, where farm bankruptcies are very high, suicides among farmers are very high, and so they care a lot about foreign markets because they care about keeping their farms together and their family's livelihood. So I do think they're keeping track of this, even if the day in and day out of the debates are left to the people like us who are paying attention for better or for worse.
Okay, we'll keep watching in that case.
Yeah.
Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's been a huge week in the US-China trade war, but as we round off the week, we had some really fascinating numbers come out of China on Friday morning. Sidney Leung from the political economy desk here at the South China Morning Post. Just before we stepped into the podcast studio, I heard one of the senior editors walk past your desk and he kind of summed up what the news was in one very nice line. What was that line?
I think he said, less growth, fewer babies.
Perfect. So why don't you unpack that for us? What does that mean?
Well, okay, so there are two biggest numbers that come out today. One is the GDP. Everybody care about GDP growth from China. Last year, it grew 6.1%. This is the lowest figure since 1990, I believe.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think people tend to be carried away by the headline growth figures, but you have to look at it in different perspectives. If you compare with other countries, that's 6.1% is very high.
Mm-hmm.
And also in China's the sheer amount of GDP, the base number is huge. So if you grew 6%, that's still a lot of expansion. But of course, if you look at the historical, trend of China's economy, it is slowing, which brings into another issue about the birth figures, because the slowing growth was exacerbated by the declining working age populations. This morning, the National Bureau of Statistics also published the figures of the newborns in 2019, which was the lowest since 1961, when China was going through a very hard period of starvation and famine.
Yeah, the Great Famine.
Yeah. I think the latest figure was 14.65 million, which is a bit lower than the 15 million in 2018. Why is this important? Because one of the main driver of China's economy is consumptions. Old people buy less than the young people. We also saw the working age populations in China was down by 890,000 in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a bit of worrisome.
Yeah, that's even more, that's probably more of a challenge than the actual lower birth rate, right? Because the smaller the workforce gets, the less productivity you can expect.
Right. We haven't really got into, the debate of the Chinese population figures, because that was another huge area of, controversy. Because up to 2016, when China officially abandoned the one-child policy and encouraged every Chinese couple to have 2 children, the demographic data were allegedly overstated for a decade to partially delay the adjustments of the one-child policy, according to a large number of experts.
Yeah, it's very widely held belief, as it is with the official economic data as well.
Right. But I think 2020 is a key year because this year they're going to do a large nationwide, it's once every decade census, which is going to, basically provides a reference on the number of babies and populations. And the census data is always more trustworthy historically than the annual, birth number provided by the government.
Yes.
So yeah, let's see what's the results.
Yeah.
Next year.
What you have here is an economy that's growing more slowly and a population which is getting smaller. So these are two challenges that the government in Beijing really has to face over the coming decades. The demographic challenge, where you have more old people and fewer working age people.
Yeah.
And economic growth, which is, the economy is still expanding, but, is it expanding enough to take care of all these people who are leaving the workforce? So that's a real challenge for the government, right?
Yeah, just to be clear, the total population is still growing. It was increasing to like 1.4 billion last year.
Which is the first time it's passed that.
Yeah. What we are talking about, the working age population was shrinking.
Sure.
Yeah. So.
And it's worth adding, as somebody from Ireland, that 14.5 million people, which that was the new birth rate last year, is more than twice the entire population of Ireland. So some perspective is perhaps important on this topic. Just to wrap up, what can the government do to sort of increase the birth rate? Are they going to launch some nationwide campaign to try and get people to have more babies?
I think they have been doing, in different ways. I think last year we reported that on the stamps, they have last year was the year of pigs, right? So there is on the stamp, there are 3 pigs. There's a mom and there's 2 kids on the side. So it's sort of, encouraging, a symbol of encouraging people to have children.
Yeah.
This is more symbolic.
Subconscious.
Yeah, subconscious. But I think the more importantly, they should, provide more resources or either from education, healthcare. These are more important for women particularly. But for now, I would just want to say one thing. The government is still not ready to let go of the birth policy because they still think the two-child policy still has not released its full potential for now.
Okay, well, we shall monitor this very closely. Sidney, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to our 6 months of trade war podcasts. It's been a ride, but now that this trade war is over, I guess we won't need to make any more episodes. You have got to be kidding me. With Huawei, 5G, AI, supply chain shifts, more tariffs, more non-tariff barriers, this thing is just getting started, and we're going to be back next week with more details on how this is going to move forward. Please take the time to rate and review us on the platform on which you're listening, and you can follow our team at SCMP Economy on Twitter, and if you must, you can follow me too at F Birmingham. That's Birmingham with the B-E-R, not like the city. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the US-China Trade War Update, presented by Finbarr Bermingham. If you want to take a deep dive into the stories of people affected by the trade war, search for Behind the Tariffs, a 7-part series taking you from Chicago to Shanghai, Hong Kong to Ho Chi Minh City to meet the business people dealing with tariffs coming from both the US and China. Behind the Tariffs, available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio. Another podcast from the South China Morning Post.
For exclusive first-hand insights and analysis of China's AI industry, you need the China AI Report 2020, produced by the SCMP research team with input from the big names and pioneers in China's AI industry. It's what you need to understand and utilize AI for your business strategy. For an exclusive 50% discount, simply send an email to research@scmp.com and use the promo code EARLYBIRD in the subject header. Offer ends January 28th. The China AI Report 2020 by SCMP Research.